my name is Alice Reeve, and I am hosting this evening's episode of Footprints of Pacifica, brought to you by the Pacifica Historical Society. And this is the show where we explore the lure and the lore of Pacifica, its character and its characters. And this evening's topic is on Francisco Sanchez, and my special guest is Shirley Dry. It's very nice to have you this evening.
Thank you.
And Shirley has written a really fascinating biography on Francisco Sanchez, and the title of her article is Don Francisco Sanchez, a Man of Integrity. And tell us a little bit why you titled it that way.
When I was doing my research, I looked at a lot of the American archives, and they invariably referred to him as a man of integrity, a man of honor, a man who was noble, and so I didn't make it up.
Yeah.
That was in the records.
Well, Francisco Sanchez and his family were sort of in the middle of a defining time in California history. And you write a really great historical perspective on his life and the times at that period in the early 1800s.
Thank you, Alice.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about his family background, his grandfather, Jose, and...
His grandfather came with the De Anza party from Sonora. And this was an overland trip of some hardship. They arrived very successfully in Monterey in 1776 and remained there for a short time, and then a contingent of around 40 went up to San Francisco and waited for the packet San Carlos to come in with supplies for them. And the record says that in that period of time they did live in the same kind of structures that the Ohlone people who were already here in tule houses. When the packet arrived, they began to organize themselves and built the Presidio, which was built of adobe brick. And if you go there today, you can still see a wall of that original adobe brick in the old officers' club at the Presidio. It's very interesting to see and very gratifying to me personally. You also, well, I'll talk about the cannons later on. But anyway, Francisco's grandfather arrived with his son, who was Jose Antonio II, and Jose II was only, about 3 years old when they arrived? And he grew up here. They lived at the Presidio, where quarters for the families, they built the quarters for the families. And his father, of course, was a soldier. He was a corporal and is described as a man of some education who could read and write, which was very much an important thing at that time. I think that they continued to live there. Francisco was born in 1805.
Right.
And one of the reasons, or I guess the primary reason, that Spain was moving into Northern California was that Great Britain and Russia were both looking hungrily at California because of its resources. And Spain had always claimed California, but in order to establish a claim, you have to put people there, have settlements, and this is why Spain at that time was moving further north, was to solidify its claim to California. And we all know, of course, that Fort Ross was built and occupied by the Russians, so there really was a threat there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, tell me a little bit more about his Francisco Sanchez and his upbringings and growing up in the peninsula, his education, and how he sort of found his position in the military.
Well, one of the things that we read in doing research is the healthy environment here. And in truth, the families were having huge numbers of children. There is a record of a woman having 20 children.
And I believe Francisco Sanchez, he had 10 children.
Yes, he did. They lost a couple, but 10 did survive. And they lived a life of
sustainability.
Yeah, they could do everything. In the book on Vallejo, who was also lived here, most of us have heard of General Vallejo. He talks about, his author talks about how a man could do virtually make anything he needed, from shoes. He could make bricks. He could burn lime, whatever that's for, and make soap. He could build a building. Look at the Sanchez adobe. It was built 160 some years ago by he and his brothers. Neither one of them were engineers. Neither one of them had any kind of training in building, but they built a house that's still standing. And I've always admired a couple of aspects of the house, which looks, from this picture, quite different from the way we see it today. Shall I tell them about this?
Yeah, I would love to hear about it.
There's a balcony upstairs here, and the thing that's always intrigued me is he enclosed both ends of the balcony with a wall. And he not only enclosed them, but he put windows in them. And the question I asked myself was why? Why would you close in those sides and put windows in them? Well, who is it that's going to be sitting up there? The women doing needlework, preparing food. So they not only had a windbreak on either end, they had light coming in through those windows. And this says to me, among a number of things, that Francisco was indeed a man who was sensitive to other people, and in this case women. And in fact, his wife is part California Indian.
Oh, that's very interesting.
So, yeah, but they really were able to just about do everything they needed.
Well, he met his wife pretty early. You know, she was a young one. I think he was 28.
And he was 16.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about his education. He went to school, I believe, in San Jose. Is that right?
We infer that he did, and I will give you a little bit of information on why we infer this. Frank Stanger is San Mateo County's foremost historian, and in his book he talked about how well these young men could ride horseback and throw a lasso, and he said even better and with more grace than the cowboys of the Southwest. And he says then that evidenced by their frequent trips back and forth to San Jose, to San Francisco, and in San Jose, maternal relatives lived there. And why would they be going back and forth? Well, it turns out Francisco was 7 in 1812, and in 1811, the parents in San Jose wanted their children educated. And as some of you know, the mission fathers would not teach the settlers' children. They would only teach the Indians. And my own opinion, and I don't mean to be harsh or critical, but they didn't really want any of the settlers to have any education, or they wanted them as laborers. And they feared education. But these parents in San Jose, by golly, they found a teacher and they executed a contract with him, and I came across a copy of the contract, so I know it's true. And how much they paid this man, Villavicencia was his name, and each family paid him 18 reales a year to teach their children to read and write, and the Bible, I think it says. So it sounds to me like Francisco and his brothers were going to school in San Jose. They'd go down and probably spend the week with the maternal relatives, or whoever they were, and then come home for the weekend. And we have a lot of evidence to support the fact that he had some education. In our archives, we have a business letter that he's written to his sister. And that letter is in the most beautiful handwriting you could ever hope to see. Today, no one writes like that. And the fact is, in addition to that, if you go into the San Francisco Hall of Mayors, you'll see that his picture hangs there. He was 3 times alcalde, which is more or less like the American equivalent of a mayor. And when the Americans came in and took over, he ran for supervisor in San Francisco and was elected. And he served on the first Board of Supervisors in San Francisco. Well, it's very hard to imagine that he could have been anything other than fairly bright and competent to be able to fill these roles.
Well, he sounds like a very educated man, and I guess he was really involved in the military and then sort of moved up in the ranks of the military and even served as a captain for a brief period of
He
time.
did, yeah. Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1822, and at this point, these men all swore allegiance to Mexico, and he became, as you said, a captain and commandante of the Presidio, the San Francisco Presidio, and the tensions between the Americans and the Mexican population up here, the Mexican Dons, was growing. And the Americans came in and simply raised the flag. Fremont did down above Monterey.
Well, as a captain, there was an interesting story that you had in your article about it. It sort of showed his character a little bit. I believe that in your biography, you mentioned that he was given, the duty of dealing with a mutinied soldier, and he had to run him through with a sword. And there are writings about how that affected him and how sensitive of a man he was, that killing this individual had left him sort of distraught.
Yeah, he resigned from his job as he had an official role. Seems to me it was justice of the peace, but I can't imagine why justice of the peace would be putting down a mutiny. But he did. He ran a man through with his sword and pinned him to the deck. And he was so upset that he resigned from his position.
Yeah.
So he was a man with character and feeling. And he went on to lead the Dons after the Americans began looting the ranchos under the auspices of a so-called volunteer named Weber. He was given the role by the Americans of protecting American settlers, and he took this to mean that he could loot the ranchos. They were taking everything. They'd go in and run a whole family out of their home and take over and sleep in it and take their food, and then take the cattle to feed the American forces. And Francisco and his brothers were getting very fed up because there were two ranchos. Burry belonged to his father after 1827. And they went into San Francisco and met Washington Bartlett, who was now mayor of San Francisco. He was captain of a ship, and he found that the Mexicans were having an election when he got there. So he went in and signed up to run for mayor and brought all the sailors off his ship to vote for him, and he won. Really crooked elections from the beginning.
Right.
And so he brought some of his sailors down to take cattle from the Sanchez families, and they stop at Mission Dolores, which is now a saloon, and they get very drunk. And they go on down to Burry, but they decide they're just too drunk. They want to sleep it off. So they do, and the next morning they get up, and this really is almost a comedy of errors. The Americans all went out to gather up the cattle, and they all lined their guns up leaning against the fence of the corral. And when they did that, the Sanchez brothers took them hostage without any kind of a fight at all.
That's a great image.
And they took them over to Rancho San Pedro and began, that's here, to this adobe. Began going down the peninsula through Half Moon Bay and then across to the area of San Carlos and finally San Jose. And by the time they got there, they had about 100 Dons. And they were really very poorly armed. They maybe had guns. And the Americans got very excited and sent a Marine division down, which they were pulling a cannon. It got bogged down in the water in the swampy areas. Oof. And they got to San Carlos, and it's called the Battle of Santa Clara, but no shot was ever fired. And we have evidence that the only injury occurred when an American Marine got excited and ran his foot through with his bayonet. And
talk about a comedy of errors.
Since we don't have a lot of time, a lot of negotiating went on and on and on. Finally, the American, it was Montgomery in San Francisco, and he had no interest in hearing their stories, and he said unconditional surrender. And Francisco makes that statement, Mas vale morir, which is better to die. And again, once again, saner heads went to plead their cause, and sure enough, they came back, and they sent all the Mexican rancheros home with their horses and their cattle, and no parole, no conditions, nothing. Francisco goes home. They said, No, not even probation. And they go home, and a few days later, Montgomery learns this, and he says, that murdering Sanchez, you go and bring him in. So they went up to our adobe here and put him in chains and brought him back to Mission Dolores. And they got within sight of the mission, and someone had gone in and talked to Montgomery and made him see what his mistake was. And before even getting there, they released Sanchez, and he went back home.
Oh, so you never even made it?
No.
Wow.
No. And he continued to live a prosperous life and serve San Francisco, and then the boundary lines were drawn, and that put Francisco in San Mateo County. And he actually ran for supervisor, but he lost the election.
Why do you think he lost?
Because there was a lot of feeling the Mexican War was going on.
Oh, right.
And there was a lot of feeling against Mexican people. But he died in, now I've forgotten that date.
Well,
we
should talk a little bit more about his later life. I mean, I realized that he had sort of a higher position in the community than most people, and the land trust, when all things had settled, the land commission sort of treated Rancho San Pedro a little differently than some of the other
That's very true.
major lands.
All of the landowners, including Vallejo, who had 100,000 acres, all of them lost their property, or the majority of it. His own father, his brothers were running Bury, they lost that. There's really no record of anybody really, because the Americans kept settling, or what do they call it, squatting on the lands and claiming it, and the Americans were rather sympathetic to them. Well, Francisco applied for his grant to be legalized, and by golly, the Americans gave him his rancho. He didn't lose a square inch. Well, the question comes up, why? You know, just think about it. How come? And I came up with two reasons. One is they knew he could galvanize the Mexican rancheros to action. And the other was, well, who wants that land over there with all the fog and right on the ocean?
Oh, but they didn't realize the property values of coastal living.
Of course not.
In the future, they wouldn't have given it all away like that.
But they did, and he did not lose 1 square inch of his rancho. And he continued to live here. The newspaper of San Mateo County at that time listed the wealthiest people in the county, and it was Francisco.
Yeah, I think at the time of his death, he had about $46,000.
Yeah,
which is quite a fortune at that time.
It certainly was.
Yeah, well, and you know, he actually, in the middle of his life, I got from your biography what an astounding rancher he was. I mean,
yes, he was very successful.
His cattle numbers just were astonishing. I was really impressed to hear. And what do you think attributed to his success as a rancher?
Well, I think he was a bright man, and he was raised on a rancho, and it's interesting that his older brother, Jose de la Cruz, was not the one who ended up the leader of the ones who participated in the Battle of Santa Clara. It seems like it would have been Jose de la Cruz, but they voted among themselves for Francisco to be their leader. So he had leadership qualities. I think he must have been a fairly intelligent man, very sensible man, and people liked and admired him for these qualities. And he had a good business head, knew how to run a rancho and make it prosperous, and he succeeded very nicely. The interesting thing is that when he dies from injuries he received in a fall from a horse, the records tell us that he was taken to Mission Dolores. His body was taken to Mission Dolores in a carreta, which is we call it an ox cart. And if you go visit the Sanchez adobe today, we have just acquired an ox cart.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we had it made for ourselves. It was all made by hand.
Wow.
It's quite something, so go to Sanchez.
Is it really very large?
Oh, yeah, it's big.
Well, that's a good reason to go and visit.
Yeah, so go visit and see our new carreta.
Yeah. Well, have you taken it out for a test drive yet?
I don't think it's going to be taken out.
It's going to be tested.
No, it got there.
That's as long as it needed to go.
Yes.
Wow, that's great.
So I grew to admire him very much. Everything, when you're doing research, you come away with, I believe, with certain convictions about what you're doing. And I have to tell you, I went into this with no conviction at all. I had no idea who I would find.
I was going to ask, you have written a really extensive, the bibliography, the research you've done for this has been really extensive. I'm curious to know, what fueled your fire? What got you started to, really want to flesh out every detail? And you even have, more to do. You've mentioned to me that there's some lost diaries, possibly in Mexico, that you're really wanting to get your hands on, and even would give a grant if you had the...
I would like to establish a scholarship fund for some history major who's interested in California's Mexican era to finish up the research, since in Beachy I found a reference to Jose Antonio II, Francisco's father, to his journal. And when I asked the question about where would the journal be, and this was asked over broad territory, the answer was that Castro returned to, General Castro, who was the last governor of California under the Mexicans, returned to Mexico with all of the archives. So there's some reason to believe there may be something there. What I'd really like to do is be able to read that final paragraph to let people know the sense that I gained from a better understanding of California's Mexican era. The Mexican flag flew over California for 25 years and certainly left its impact. Look around you. Pacifica, the streets, cities all over have Spanish names.
Absolutely. And they're pretty much the same Spanish names throughout, so it's easy to know to recognize the famous names of history. And when I was reading the biography, I was like, of course, this is where Montgomery, all these names are so familiar. Oh,
I did forget to tell you that when Montgomery was coming in to take California, Francisco, he actually supported the arrival of the Americans, and so he went up to the Presidio and buried the guns and went home. And when Montgomery sent for him, he showed him where the guns were buried. And you can see the two cannons right outside that old Presidio Officers Club. So go look at those too.
Yes, something to see.
But I came away with strong feelings about that period of time, and you do know that you have to understand there was a lot of feelings, even though things were working pretty well between the Americans and the Mexican people. And I ended my article with this. The United States entered California as conquerors, and it is axiomatic that conquerors do not lionize the conquered, particularly those who challenge them, as did Francisco and his compadres in the Battle of Santa Clara. The invaders' diminishing of the subject people persists over time. Today, if one inquires about early San Francisco history, the city historian presents one with a starting date of 1846, the year of United States entry into California. In dismissing the Sanchez family and the other land-grant families of Spanish California, we do them a disservice and we impoverish our heritage as Californians.
Wow. It's a very powerful ending to this. And actually, right above that final paragraph is three great pictures. I don't know if we can get a close-up on this, but this here is Don Francisco
as an older man.
And his tombstone right here, and also his daughter,
Luisa.
She's
his oldest
daughter. So those are some great images that you've provided for us. And there's actually the mission as well.
That's the way it looks today.
Yeah.
Wow. And we have a very, very successful outdoor educational program for fourth grade children who are studying California history. And the program is so popular that by the end of May, it's booked up for the following year.
Wow.
And we do some overflow
That's a hot
programs.
ticket.
It is. And we still will have a waiting list of 20 or 30 schools. And the program, the kids get to get in the mud and make adobe bricks. They make candles. They grind corn. They have to sit on a saddle and rope a fake steer. And
oh, that sounds fun.
Yeah,
so it's only for fourth graders?
Yeah, because when we did third, fourth, fifth graders, we found that we had the same children coming year after year, and we were turning away schools.
Right.
So we limited it to 4th grade.
That was smart.
And it's a very successful program. The children love it. They're learning so much, and we present it to them in 3 ways, and each way is a reinforcement of the whole program. We talk to them, we take them on a tour of the grounds, they see a video, and then they go through those stations making candles, adobe bricks, and grinding corn on a mano and metate.
Oh, they get to realize how tedious it was to even make a meal.
And
I know, that's...
roping a steer. And
I remember doing the corn grinding when I was a kid and thinking, gosh,
and the third
to make
Saturday,
a loaf of bread.
Yeah, the 3rd Saturday in September we have Rancho Day, in which we try to recreate all those lifeways.
Yeah.
And our volunteers built a small oven. It's called an hornito. And we bake bread in there, and you can taste the bread. We make tortillas and churn butter and do all the things that they did in the
So you
rancho era.
participated in that every year?
Oh, yeah.
Well, for next year, folks, that would be a great event to attend. Well, and so I guess that wraps up pretty much the life of Don Francisco Sanchez. Is there any final thoughts you'd like to give? You know, and...
Well, I think yes. It bothers me that during the 30 years I've been volunteering at the Adobe, that people would come in with and tell me that they were, you know, descendants of these Mexican families, and always they wanted to know if they were Spanish. And my answer to them was, you're Mexican and be proud of it.
Right.
But you see what has happened when that last paragraph?
I do.
The diminishing of the people that the invader conquers. And to this day, there are so many people with negative feelings about anyone from Mexico.
Yeah.
And I think this is a terrible tragedy.
It is a tragedy.
Personally.
It is.
So
well,
please remember that our history was heavily impacted by the Mexican population here, and Francisco and his compadres were often two and three generations in Mexico. And they would no more call themselves Spanish than I would call myself German.
Right.
So,
well,
you know, remember.
That's about all we have for today and the topic on Don Francisco
Okay,
Sanchez.
thank you.
I really appreciate all your time, your insight, and your expertise on the topic.
Well, thank you, Allison, and thank you for the opportunity to share this.
Well, we want to remind you, our viewers, to check us out. Also, you know, give support to the Pacifica Historical Society. Contact Kathleen Manning, our producer. She can be reached at 650-359-5462, or visit the website pacifichistory.org. And I want to end with our famous quote from Longfellow that says, "Lives of great men all remind us that we can live our lives sublimely, and departing leave behind footprints."